That's one of those things you just can't do.
Click my fingers.
Yeah, one of these days.
Yeah. Life tasks.
Can you whistle?
I can whistle.
Oh, okay. It's like you're not one of the people who can't do both.
I didn't realize that was the.
I've known a couple of people who can't do this out.
And you continue to associate with these people?
No, I don't. I should have said I have known those people.
You have known. You have met.
Yeah.
Passing.
Also voted today.
Congratulations.
Yeah, which wasn't.
Who did you vote for? Are you allowed to say?
Yeah, I'm allowed to say I begrudgingly I have put up a big thing about being like, oh, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden. I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden. But I think I most recently listened to a Naomi Klein interview and then didn't listen to anything else in between then.
Well, that's how we all
now.
operate, isn't it? You just respond to the most recent piece of media you listen to.
Exactly. And she was like,
more intelligent opinion.
Yeah. So I voted for him very angrily. But then, most of it is just, there's just always stupid crap on ballots. And especially in California, it's like, we just vote for everything down to like, this isn't literal, but like dog catcher, stuff like that.
Sure,
and it's oh God, it's always such an effort. Because I always want to like look these people up.
You voted for Joe Biden accidentally when you thought he was running for dog catcher.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, wow, he'd be really good at that.
What would Joe Biden be really good at? I don't know.
But I could see him being a good guy. Have you ever seen the Eddie Murphy movie? The one, is it Coming to America, where they're like the two old guys in the barbershop?
I have no idea.
All right, well, it's an Eddie Murphy movie, and they go to a barbershop, and they're always just like these two old men who are played by Eddie Murphy, I'm pretty sure, and they're just like talking shit and like just being like grumpy old men in the barbershop. He'd be good at that. He'd be really good at that. Him and Corn Pop could do it.
Okay. Maybe we'll let him know.
Let him know, yeah. I am on a Slack with Joe Biden, so... He's in the local DSA chapter that I'm in. Well, should we just go for it?
Are you in the DSA?
Technically,
do the DSA charge dues, don't they? And they're quite...
Here's the thing.
Okay.
Here's the thing. The dues are very steep.
Technicality.
The dues are very steep.
Yeah, that's what I heard. Very expensive to be in the DSA.
Hopefully no DSA cops are listening to this. But when I went back home, I realized that there was a DSA chapter in the county that I live in. County that I live in isn't that big. I messaged him and I was...
You were the chapter.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Honestly, pretty close. And I messaged the president and he was just like, they have their own websites. Usually, I think on DSA membership websites, it's like, you want to become a member, here's the PayPal or whatever, like pay for it. And then the one in the county I live in, or that I'm from, was just like, it's such a bad website that it's just like, sign up, just put your email in, you're in the DSA. So I did that. Okay. Technically, yes, now I guess I am in the DSA. And it was funny because I just got an email.
I mean, there's probably a lot of organizations that would like to claim their mailing list is their memberships. So.
Exactly. Well, it was really funny because I got an email last week and they were like, we're doing our drive to get new members. And they said something like, we're looking to up our membership by like 200%, which means we need like 10 extra people. And I was just like, oh man. Oh no.
Vanguard of the revolution.
Yeah.
If you were there.
Yeah. Well, I get the emails. So to answer your question, am I in the DSA? I don't know. I get the emails.
You'd have to ask the DSA.
You'd have to ask the DSA, yeah.
Okay, yeah. They'll have you.
Yeah. I was on one of their, what's it called? Like Zoom meetings. It was good. Smart people. It was cool. It was just good to see because my county, the best people. Because my county is not necessarily the best in California. But yeah, it was just good to see those people. I think I mentioned Lenin at one point. Like this old guy was like, "What?" So what are you gonna do?
Yeah, the DSA could go pretty much any way.
Yeah,
any which way.
So I don't know if the DSA wants me, but hey, Big Ten. So,
Big Ten.
Yeah. Ideologically, not in terms of actual numbers. Small 10 in terms of numbers.
Yeah. 10 ideologies, 8 people.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. What are you going to do?
Yeah. I feel like I've got a few different ideologies any given day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And now we're trying to narrow those down.
Yeah. Welcome to Auxiliary Statements.
Auxiliary Statements, yeah. Welcome to Auxiliary Statements.
Where we try and work out how to be socialists.
Yeah, exactly.
In theory.
And just talk shit.
Yeah, we'll just talk shit.
I'm Jack.
I'm Dan.
And yeah, I guess we'll just get right into it. As promised. To all of our fans,
we might have promised them the whole book.
We definitely won't promise them the whole book.
We managed a chapter.
We managed a chapter. Ralph Miliband's Marxism and Politics. Technically, this is chapter 2. Class and Conflict. How'd you get on with it?
It was good. I was just saying before, it's an introductory book, and we only read one chapter of that, so quite a lot of things not fully elucidated. And it was also written in 1977, so there are a few places he's still quite sanguine on the industrial working class.
Yeah.
He's also still quite sanguine on the idea that revolutionary class consciousness will come if we just, or he at least leaves a few things open, which
he said something about Maoists.
Date a little bit, there's a little bit of a slight against the Maoists,
which I was like, damn, okay, jeez.
Yeah. I'd rather not get into the debate about what the Soviet Union was, because it's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, we'll save that for another time. When it becomes revealed that we're all this is a Maoist, if not Juche's podcast. So.
Okay. Yeah. We'll when the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party revealed their 50-year plan to instill socialism.
One of these days.
By being the most ruthless capitalist in the world. But not quite the most ruthless, perhaps.
I think it's the long game.
It is the long game, perhaps, yeah. Forget the Lenin rising from the tomb and the Simpsons is now.
Must destroy capitalism. Classic. I feel like, because I Simpsons, absolutely classic show. One of my favorite, if not like definitely my favorite show, to perhaps favorite creative venture ever. And I remember seeing that episode when I was a kid, and I was just like, man, Russia's so crazy. All those communists, they're so crazy, man. There's a communist country, it's called Russia. That's so nuts. One of these days I'd like to go see Lenin's body. I think that'd be kind of cool. Can you still?
I've really no idea.
Yeah, cool.
I think it's a bit macabre, and also it's very macabre.
Yeah,
and also I think just put him in the ground.
Put him in the ground. Yeah, you can't.
I mean, I don't want to be too like. I mean, it's a materialist podcast. It's just well, it's not even going to rot anymore. It's just very well preserved. Carbon-based matter.
Yeah,
but,
it's creepy.
But lay him to rest.
You know who I would go see eventually if he ever dies is Putin. I think that would be just an completely different vibe, but I'd like to go see that. I think that'd be pretty funny.
Do you think he's aiming for like
embalmment
to be embalmed?
Yeah,
pickled.
Yeah, I get the feeling he'll be pickled standing up though, whereas Lenin's kind of like laying down. He'll be like pointing or something like that, or like with his shirt off on his horse.
Make a dramatic statue.
Yeah. Like whoever that Chinese emperor was who got buried with all the terracotta warriors, but they're actual like Russians who he just killed and put inside. That'd be cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, what were we talking about?
Very cool.
We're talking about Marxism and politics. I don't really know how to intro this. I guess we kind of did, but I mean, this conflict or this chapter, as I guess kind of tell by the title, all about introducing class, the ideas of conflict and class, and putting them together for class conflict. He does do a pretty good job, I think, of just going over all of the basic ideas, but in a really clear way, but also kind of challenging some ideas of classical Marxism, or at least maybe elucidating them more than you would hear at like your local DSA chapter. You know what I mean? Like, he doesn't just give you the like proletariat and bourgeoisie. He kind of goes into that and, you know.
Yeah, it's a combination of using Marx, if not against the Marxists, then at least in collaboration with them. It does a really good job of, in the middle parts of the chapter, like introducing us to a idea of class analysis. Sort of starts to break down society into various different classes. But yeah. I mean, he kicks off with a really quite an enjoyable read, a discussion about conflict.
And the two kinds of conflict.
Yeah. He's suggesting that conflict is central to politics, both central to Marxist politics, but central to politics of various types, but read in various different ways. And he has this process of comparing Marxist politics to liberal politics and their conception of conflict. Yeah.
Do you want to give us that? I guess it's the second paragraph in the liberal view of politics.
Why don't you go ahead, or I can just try and synthesize it.
I'll go ahead, because I think it's got some good points. So he says, in the liberal view of politics, conflict exists in terms of problems which need to be solved. The hidden assumption is that conflict does not or need not run very deep, that it can be managed by the exercise of reason and goodwill and a readiness to compromise and agree. On this view, politics is not civil war conducted by other means, but a constant process of bargaining and accommodation on the basis of accepted procedures and between parties who have decided that as a preliminary that they could and wanted to live together more or less harmoniously. Not only is this sort of conflict not injurious to society, it has positive advantages. It is not only civilized, but civilizing. is not only a means of resolving problems in a peaceful way, but also of producing new ideas, ensuring progress, achieving ever greater harmony, and so on. Conflict is functional, a stabilizing force rather than a disruptive force. So in a perfect world, that'd be good.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
Sounds sweet.
That'd be really, really great.
Yeah, it's basically pluralism, right? Like everybody, all opinions are valid, and we'll put them all together, and we'll work out the most reasonable, rational synthesis of all of the interests. And if any disequilibrium emerges, then we'll restore equilibrium and harmony.
Yeah, by acting in good faith.
Yes, yeah, because the world's full of good faith actors.
Exactly. And I mean, I think, that's one of the things I wrote down is just that it implies good faith on whoever is being arbitrated between. It implies good faith on behalf of the arbitrator and also equal footing, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the crucial one when we come on to a Marxist definition is like, we do not live in a world where everybody's on equal footing. There are people who are dominated and oppressed and exploited, and there are people who do that exploitation.
And I guess this is super prevalent for a lot of reasons. But I mean, one of the reasons is because this probably does work if your idea of like when somebody's a conflict is like, like your kid threw his frisbee in my yard again and like broke my window. You know what I mean? But it's like this totally does not allow for any kind of institutional analysis, does it? Or of really like any kind of political real world how things work, right?
Sure, yeah.
And it also treats everything as individuals, kind of like
absolutely, yeah. All conflicts are between individuals or groups of individuals, perhaps. Whereas for Marxism, it's interested in a very different category of thing. Like he talks about social aggregates.
Yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise known as classes.
Yeah, wow.
Who potentially come into conflict with each other. So it's not a question of like individuals on an equal footing with an equal position, but groups of people determined by a role that they fulfill in society and a relation which is predetermined by that relationality.
Yeah, right, absolutely. So yeah, and so exactly. So the Marxist approach, he says, is very different. And I mean, I guess it just acts as a way to get around all of those problems, right? So this view of conflict, Miliband says, is not a matter of problems to be solved, but a state of domination and subjection, to be ended only by a total transformation of the conditions which gave rise to it. No doubt this kind of conflict can be attenuated, but only because the ruling class is by one means or another, coercion, concessions, or persuasion, to prevent the subordinate classes from seeking emancipation. And this is the key bit right here. Ultimately, stability is not a matter of reason, but of force. The antagonists are irreconcilable, and the notion of genuine harmony is a deception or a delusion, at least in the relation to class societies. So it's a lot less of like my boss did this thing to me, I'm going to take him to court and have this totally fair, arbitration by the state. It's a lot more of conflict is something that's always happening, right? It's constant, and has to do with kind of the chafing of classes, right?
Yeah, and it has upswings and it has downswings, or there are more prevalent examples that you can point to. Here are classes in conflict, either in a strike or even a contest in normal political circumstances, kind of thing. But it's always present, as you say, in like all of the relations between you and your boss or your employer, or your relationships even between the state, or all these different interactions that you have with class and class relations, which people are having all the time, or classes are experiencing all the time. And it's something I'd like to learn to look for much more in the world in which I live. Like I feel like we are so conditioned to look at the world in which we live and see the sort of liberal version of conflict, to expect to be given a fair shake, kind of thing. But like you could have much better, or it'd be good to develop a much better reading of the world, which is like you investigate it for those points of like tension and torsion that are class based and sort of symptoms of a broader process of exploitation that's happening.
Absolutely, yeah. And this, as I think is pretty apparent, does allow for that institutional analysis, because it forces that, right? You can't have this view of conflict as these, it's kind of like sociological reading of like these two things called classes butting up against each other, without understanding where those come from, how they're formed, and how that affects you, and everybody you are related to, and I don't mean like that in like a familial way. I mean that in like everybody in kind of like your social bubble, social relations, yeah. Where those come from and how that works, right? Should we read that Grundrisse
quote?
Yeah. So Miliband quotes, to kind of explain a little bit more about what class actually is, he quotes the Grundrisse, and he says that to Marx, society does not consist of individuals, but expresses the sum of interrelations, the relations within which these individuals stand. As if someone were to say, seen from the perspective of society, there are no slaves and no citizens. Both are human beings. Rather, they are that outside society. To be a slave, to be a citizen, are social characteristics, relations between human beings A and B. Human being A, as such, is not a slave. He is a slave in and through society. Yeah, I mean, that just kind of says it, right? That is a very succinct way of explaining what class is. And
clearly written under the gaze of Hegel. Marx still operating, or continue to operating throughout his life with this history, or maybe baggage, depending on your position of like Hegelianism, but a really Hegelian point that like you are nothing without the things in which you stand in relation to, like you are defined by those. And it's nice to see there's nothing specific about any particular human being, nothing specific about relations between human beings in general. All of these problems stem from social relations, which are a product of a particular social arrangement. And therefore those social arrangements and social relations can be changed.
Absolutely, yeah, in theory. Hopefully.
In theory.
Yeah. I remember when I was like quite a bit younger, and I'd like first heard of Marx. I like went to like my local bookstore and I saw the Grundrisse on like the shelf, and I couldn't really see it, and like went to go grab it off the shelf, and I was like, I'm gonna read this. And there's just like this huge book that like fell and almost like broke my toe, and I just put it back, and I was like, okay, never mind. It's not reading that.
I mean, if you'd have opened it, you'd have found it probably more challenging.
Exactly.
I'd rather just drop this on my foot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But at least one good quote there.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I've never read the Grundrisse or made much effort to, so I shouldn't slight it in that respect.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure,
it's a collection of notes that were written
yeah.
to aid Marx in the writing of Capital, and then was subsequently published. Very late in the 1950s or 60s, I think. So it stands in this position of suddenly really changing people's perspective on the writings of Marx. Led to the discipline of Marxist humanism, and quite a lot of reevaluations of how people thought about Marx and what his position was. But that's a broader background. That's not going to.
Well, thank you.
With that.
I always, man, what a fascinating, I guess, job. I don't know how else to say it, but that would have been just experience to just be one of the people who's just like opens the storage container.
Because what did Marx actually publish in his lifetime? Like the Communist Manifesto and the first volume of Capital.
Yeah.
I mean, there may be other things. There is speeches that he gave, which probably count as publication. Obviously, he was a journalist for much of his life, so a lot of his journalistic work was published. But lots of those things that we think of as being key texts, we talk about like volume 2 and 3 of Capital as if they were sort of subsequent works, but like just much like the Grundrisse, like collections of notes and addendums. And
do you know if those notes are in all of his letters and everything? Do you know if those were kind of in the custody of Engels, or do you know if they were like in his family?
Quite a few things were published after Marx's death, but by Engels, I think. I don't know whether that was in a systematic way or to settle political disputes that were being had at the time, kind of thing. But
good stuff.
I mean,
Good stuff.
I mean, the study of anyway.
Well, epistemology?
No.
Ornithology?
No.
I have ideas.
There's the study of the specifics of the text and the history of the text.
Oh, historiography?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. Well, okay, directly after quoting the Grundrisse, which up until a couple days ago I was pronouncing Grundrisse, so thank you, Dan. Miliband basically goes into kind of, I suppose he's saying this next bit as kind of like a way to immediately halt anyone from maybe like having a critical reaction to that definition of class too much, because he says more or less just something like well, sure, okay, you might read this and think, well, there is social mobility and upward mobility and all this stuff, and it is semi-fluid between classes. And he also says something along the lines of, what does he say? You might not feel totally antagonistic towards another, like other members of class, or like you might like one guy, or like, oh, you might like Elon Musk or something like that, which we won't get into. But he basically says that that doesn't mean that there isn't always conflict, right? In other ways, it's not just about you. It's not just about like your personal feelings, because you might say, oh, wow, Jeff Bezos, I love what he's doing with Amazon, but you might also like, I don't know, work at Amazon and your job sucks. You know what I mean? That's like a very like direct example.
Yeah, I mean, he's making the quite obvious retort that one would make to somebody who was saying, well, everybody should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, kind of thing. Like, we can't all pull ourselves up to the same position. Like, they're always like these people have enriched. I mean, the uber rich of today, Jeff Bezos and the like, are like a category all unto themselves. But speaking more generally, like, you can't all be property owning capitalists.
Exactly, which is also, I feel like now, I don't know, I can't really get too much of a sense of it out here. I mean, I guess it's everywhere, but definitely in America with the idea of the American dream and stuff, there is this idea that you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps. But you just, whenever you hear that, you just want to be like, you know, Oprah specifically is like a statistical anomaly. That's happened to like 8 people. You know what I mean?
I mean, I can understand. I mean, America was founded as this kind of like, there was that much land, you could go and get your parcel. The development of classes took a really interesting, was a really interesting process in America, the development of classes. Something that I'm not really to speak on, and we should think about it in future, perhaps. But
well, it's interesting. I when I was back home most recently, I was reading Philip Fauner's first volume of it's some very literal title. It's like a history of the American working class, or history of the labor movement in the United States. And it's basically just from colonial times to, I think, the founding of the AFL, which is a very long time. But he says that right after the Revolutionary War, it really took capitalists a long time to like get people working in factories and to even be interested.
After the Civil War, you said?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, after the Revolution.
The Revolution,
to get people interested in buying things enough, because it's like, oh, if you could just go and get your own land, which was like one of the main promises, right, of the Revolution. If you could just go and do that, then people were still just making clothes in their houses, and they were so self-sufficient that it was like a guy might have enough money to go to like Ohio, or I guess not Ohio, like New England or something like that, and set up a factory. But it's like it took a lot of ups and downs to do that.
I mean, it would be really interesting that I would enjoy, like to learn more about like that process of how that was forced upon people.
It looks like
or what kind of like state action, or
a lot of state action.
I don't know.
Yeah. It seems like it was. They tried it a couple times, and it seemed like it was working. Then it failed. Because I guess the British. Well, yeah, we're getting sidetracked, but I guess the British really didn't want them to industrialize, so they were constantly like stopping it, and people were like, "Well, we don't need this." But he also goes on to say, Miliband, I mean, that I'll just quote this paragraph again. The focus always is on class antagonism. This is on page 20 for me. Is on class antagonism and class conflict. This does not mean that Marxism does not recognize the existence of other kinds of conflict within these societies and between them, ethnic, religious, national, etc., but it does consider these rivalries, conflicts, and wars as directly or indirectly derived from or related to class conflicts. Whether it is right, and then he just kind of has like a little like CYA, because he's like, whether it's right or not to do so is beside the point. I'm not going to answer that question. But I mean, it's important for us to footnote in the way that he footnotes. Exactly.
Because he sort of glosses over the idea. And from this text, we're not in a position to sort of like explain the interactions or the lack of interaction between like class oppression and other types of oppression and the like. But it's really important. It is important to note that like Miliband, and I think also Marx in his own way, and us definitely very much willing to recognise like the oppression of people on the basis of race or like sexual orientation. It got me kind of thinking about like go ahead. But at the same time, those things interact, right? Like
exactly. Like it got me thinking about if I was kind of trying to like debunk this, if I was like some chud, what I would say, and I would probably say something about maybe to like recent example, like the Rwandan genocide or something like that, being like that was clearly ethnic tensions and it exploded, and what are you going to, checkmate Karl Marx, what are you going to talk about there? But then it's like, okay, well, if you think about the history of Rwanda as it exists as the geographical borders of Rwanda. The only reason that there were really those, warring ethnicities, quote unquote, the Hutus and the Tutsis, was because of Belgian mismanagement. I suppose if you were the Belgians,
my understanding of this, nothing to quote from, take it as my whatever, that those categories had very little meaning.
Exactly.
Until colonialism happened.
Well, exactly. And it's specifically the Belgians. And that was in like the 20th century, because the Belgians came in and they were like, you guys, you are the better ones, and you should be like, very typical kind of like ruling class playing off of the tensions, or just completely inventing tensions between what you could describe as a working class or even just slave population. And so, yeah, you could have a reading of it where it was very much tensions caused by ruling class conflict with working class. It feels so brutal to say working class, but yeah. Yeah, I suppose it just wants
I would like to know more about that case, but it sort of sounds like the Belgians there were introducing class into a society through whatever means there were that existed already. And then, much like, maybe it's worth doing another footnote now. Much later, well, a little bit later in this chapter, he just talks about like class analysis of the third world. He doesn't say a great deal about it. It's cursory in the same fashion. And obviously this is in the 70s, so like things have developed very much since then. But the legacy of colonialism, he suggests, leads to a degree of uniqueness, amongst other things. Along with other things. Yeah, it's uniqueness in the composition of class relations in third world countries. In some ways, like he suggests, as a sort of like local middle strata of capitalists, and then the biggest capitalist institutions are from the first world kind of thing. Which
I think totally holds true to this day. Absolutely. That's not really like a hot take. That's just that's the way things work. And then I guess he goes on to really kind of try to apply these ideas to politics, right? And to talk about now that we have these ideas, we have these definitions, what does this mean on the political sphere? And so he talks a little bit about class consciousness, right? He talks about what it means to be class conscious. And he basically says, okay, this is really easy it's funny too, because he just immediately falls back on these terms of bourgeoisie and proletariat. After basically this whole thing of being like, for a lot of this chapter, he's like, well, we can't really define, what it means to be working class. It's hard to define kind of what it means to be bourgeoisie, especially now, because like the managerial class, and because of like the service industry and all this stuff. But he kind of does what most Marxists do, right? And we were talking about this a bit, about he just eventually just falls back on the vocabulary of bourgeoisie and proletariat, right? It's very funny, because again, like he does spend so much time in this chapter attempting to define working class, now that we have these ideas of conflict and of class, that you can't do that every time you want to talk about these ideas, right? So he kind of just does, again, just fall back on, bourgeoisie and proletariat,
Sure, yeah. That does have some relevance when he gets to. So basically, the first section of this chapter is all about like conflict. We've basically covered it in a lot of respects, I think. And then as you say, he goes on to talk about consciousness, right? He sets up this idea from Marx that, or a distinction between classes being existing in themselves, as opposed to existing for themselves, like. The arrangements of capitalist society bring these groupings, these social aggregates, these classes into existence. But then it takes a certain experience of living under those conditions to lead classes to recognize themselves as classes. He suggests that Marx suggests that classes, or the working class in particular, doesn't really exist until it has a political expression. He talks about them needing a political party in some respects, but basically just class necessarily for Marx has some kind of political component, because it's always there is a collective experience of living under a certain set of social relations which necessitates that, he's basically sort of like developing. It feels like there's a little bit of a contradiction in some respects, because like initially he says like classes exist because of conflict, so they are an innate thing in the society, and then then he sort of develops that to say that classes exist when they are conscious of their interest.
Well, does he
and
say
then
that
are prepared
for,
to sort of fight for their interests.
Yeah, does he say that for both classes? And I guess just being broad and saying the ruling class and the working class, or the subjugated class. Does he say that for both, or does he say that that's only really the case for the working class? Because I mean, I guess, are you just innately class conscious if you're part of the ruling class?
I mean, he suggests that it's much easier for them to recognize their self-interest.
Yeah. Well, I guess he says, when he's discussing kind of the capitalist class, the ruling class, he says, the capitalist class, however, extends well beyond these interests and includes many people who fulfill specific professional and other functions on behalf of these interests, who are in various ways, by virtue of status, occupation, kinship, associated with them. And that kind of hits on kind of what you're saying about just that idea of status, and about how because he kind of then brings it back into the working class. He says that even though it's hard to have a strict definition of what the working class is, and we'll get into that in a sec, but he says that like the idea of status has a lot to do with it, right? And I don't know, that was something that interested me, because it's like, you know it when you see it, right? But it's not like, God, how could you, I don't know, status, how could you write that down and define that? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, it brings in quite a lot of complicated aspects of class. Clearly, in this, what's usually attached to Marx and Marxism is a very sort of like economic definition of class. But if you talk to people in this country about class, it takes on a huge range of like cultural signifiers. I mean, we've gotten to sort of like the ludicrous point now where in this country, like if you live in a town in the north of England, you used to work in industrial setting, but you're retired, probably on a reasonable pension, a pension that's been protected by multiple administrations and parties in government, because like they're surefire voters to try and win. And you probably also own your own house. Yeah. You might even own other ones, and then you're a rentier kind of thing. But you get to be called working class because you're white and you used to work in an industrial setting. Whereas like if you live in an inner city and you're from an ethnic minority background, say, and you work a precarious job, and but you may have gone to university, because like everybody goes to, a great number of people go to university now because that option has been opened up to a lot of people. You suddenly have some sort of signifiers that don't really marry with what we want to traditionally talk about as culturally working class.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a bit where he says the working class is therefore part of that collective laborer which produces surplus value, right? So that's kind of like the typical classical Marxist. This is what working class is. They produce surplus value from a position of subordination, and at the lower ends of the income scale, and also at the lower ends of what might be called the scale of regard. So two of those ideas, I mean, lower ends of the income scale, kind of like what you're saying, that's pretty obvious. But I mean, position of subordination, it's a little bit, I guess that's fairly more obvious. But also the scale of regard. How do you define the scale of regard? Because that would be like, is it through the lens of the ruling class? Is it through the lens of the working class? Because if it's through the lens of the working class, it's just going to be like, I don't know, he's just some schmuck working a job like me, you know what I mean? But it's like, that made me think about the scale of regard must be something that's filtered through cultural phenomenon, like almost like the media.
Yeah, you know? Although he doesn't really give very much of a definition of what he means by scale of regard. Yeah. He just sort of throws it out there. I'm wondering whether it's possible for the system itself to care. Yeah. To have higher regard for certain people and not others. I mean, obviously, if we were thinking of capitalism as having a regard, it would have highest regard for those people who own capital and are able to deploy it in such a way as they can create more capital from the use of capital, kind of thing. Yeah, exactly. Those people in the best position to expand capital. Yeah. If you talk about capital having an interest, it's the further expansion, the growth of capital kind of thing. Yeah. And capitalist firms are dedicated to that task. It might
just be something where it's like some sort of occupation that you can answer the question of like, what are you doing? In terms of like when somebody's like, oh, so what are you doing? With an answer that's like, not just, oh, I do a very simple job. You know what I mean? Because it's like, I don't know, when, as a personal example, it's like when I tell people from back home, they're like, oh, so what are you doing out in England? It's like, I work in a warehouse. You know what I mean? That's not like a job that is like something that you're told you should aspire to. You know what I mean? But it is like, if I were to be like, oh, what are you doing? It's like, oh, I work in finance. You know what I mean? Or like I work in media, or I work in, I don't know. Like, do you see the distinction I'm making? Maybe that it's just like a job that has connotations to it.
Cultural signifiers attached to it. And sure.
Yeah. That phrase, scale of regard. It's like I know exactly what he means, but it just really tripped me up as something that could be just so subjective. You know what I mean?
He's okay. Yeah. It's interesting because he's introduced this idea that in Marx there is a distinction between objective and subjective definitions of class, and so he basically uses the middle third of this chapter to try and talk about the objective conditions of class, and then later on he talks about subjective, which he's mostly just referring to consciousness in that regard, I think. But he's discovered for himself a problem, right? He's suggested, as you just described, that Marx is interested. He's trying to define the working class, and he's interested in. He defines them as productive workers, and what does he mean by that? Like people who. Whose labour can be bought, and then that labour can be deployed to make more money than it costs to employ that labour. I mean, that's the basic mechanism of capitalism, right? You pay somebody less than the value of what they produce, and then you pocket the rest, surplus value. But and he goes on to say that could fit a whole host of different categories, right? It's not necessarily industrial workers, and it's not necessarily workers who are producing one very specific thing. It could be lots of people contributing to the production of a thing, and you're a bit sort of lost as to what it is necessarily that you're contributing to. So that's where he introduces this idea of the collective labourer, because it's a whole different collection of people that contribute to a task of labouring to an end product that might be forgotten, kind of thing, or people facilitate they facilitate something making value, like somebody who puts stock on shelves in a supermarket, right? Like they've not produced something in the sense of like a physical product, but they're facilitating the ability for those goods to realize the value that they have installed in them by putting them on the shelves and making them ready to be sold.
But then he also says though that if you include that as the definition, then you kind of also, which he does, you have to include like some white collar workers.
Sure, right? And not even like white collar and service workers, but also managerial staff, executive personnel. I mean, like tech workers in some respects, kind of thing. Like people who we're in sort of current contemporary nomenclature, you might call the professional managerial class.
Which he brings up.
But but he thinks that those people who contribute to that process of collectively labouring to produce a thing extends all the way to potentially like the topmost layers of capitalist society. And so this is why you're saying like we need to find some kind of cutoff point if these terminology is to mean anything.
Exactly.
I was saying before we started recording, like it feels like you're sometimes when you're introduced to Marxism, it's like these two solid warring factions you can discreetly work out, and you can come up with some definitions that allow for a discrete definition of one grouping or another. But when you're trying to do quite a detailed reading of society, particularly from a political perspective, particularly when you're trying to work out the best way to deploy whatever resources you have to work out who you could actually recognize a common interest with, or who you can't, who would, those groups in society who you will never share a common interest with necessarily. Supposing that you're from the working class and you're trying to strengthen a working class position in a potentially revolutionary direction, kind of thing. You could take the easy way out and find a really strict cutoff point, but it's not necessarily going to aid you if you're actually trying to deploy Marxism in a way which is going to allow you to interact with the world in a productive manner. Kind of thing.
And in a political manner, absolutely. And so I guess that's why when you always hear people talk about the professional managerial class, right? I mean, what that is basically people who are not the ones reaping all of the rewards, right, that the capitalist class does, but they're the ones whose interests are tied with the capitalist class. And it's funny because I was reading this, and the day before I went in for a shift at work, and at work it was kind of a bit of a shit show because like my supervisor was getting into it with our managers, and the managers were complaining about the supervisor, and like it was really interesting because I was having a conversation with a guy that I work with about how understaffed we were. And I was like, well, how do you think it works here? Is it just that like the head offices say like, here's X amount of money, you can spend that on how many people you need to hire to the managers, right? And that's all they can do. Because it was like, we just did not have enough people to basically run the shop. And he was basically saying, yeah, that's exactly the way it works, right? So I don't know. There are these tensions between the managerial class and the actual like capitalist class, I suppose. Definitely between like supervisors and managers. But it is also funny because I think you could really make an effort to explain to some managers that, you know, your interests might not be as divided as they're made out to be, right? Because the store would work so much better if they would just let people run it who worked there, right? We would know exactly what we needed. We would stop getting, you know, stock that we don't need. We would not be understaffed. We wouldn't be understocked. At least you'd hope. So I don't know. This was all running through my head because I obviously was reading this and I was like, oh, the professional managerial class and workers, you know, never the two shall meet in terms of ideology or whatever. But I don't know. What do you think about that?
I mean, he definitely does suggest that like what he quotes as the new working class.
Yeah.
I mean, in 1977, he sees it as like growing, but now we've gotten to a point where really quite substantive in some respects, or in some industries kind of thing. Although a whole industry is composed of, I mean, thinking of tech or
sure,
I don't know. But he does think it's a place for where he poses it as then and perhaps still now in some respects a real open question for Marxist sociology or political sociology. Like I don't know whether I'm hesitant to call them a new class, but this is element of contemporary capitalist society. Like which way will they fall? And like,
yeah, exactly.
How could you
use
what
that?
interests can you appeal to?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as well because I mean, I suppose the question is like, the management seems to have like multiple aims, right? Is it there to facilitate? It's. I mean, in some ways, it's there to discipline you, right? Which is a way to make the business more productive. They get more work out of you because they're always watching, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But at the same time, in terms of like having the right stock or just organizing a shop floor or a supermarket floor or like rotoring, like that's nonsense about like. In certain service sectors, like rotoring happens every week and you never get a consistent rotor. It's always moved around and it's seemingly just to keep you on your toes because you could always be asked to work at any given time kind of thing. Not necessarily productive in the sense of like if you gave somebody a better work-life balance, they might work more productively or think more favorably of their workplace kind of thing.
Right,
so there is this conflict of like, are you they might be like just trying to extract as much, there's the whip hand kind of thing, but there is also like just the practical are they there to just practically organize more smooth running? And in some respects, there is always a place, perhaps, for like. I mean, at some point, it would be really nice. It would be good. We'd like to get into topics like planning and and sort of like cybernetics and these kind of things. Like, what kind of structures of organization, what kind of systems, theories, do you need for a smooth running of a system? In some respects, maybe it is just like laissez-faire, leave it to the workers to organize themselves. But how much like command structures do you need? And you definitely don't want that command structure which is there just simply to like to discipline for the sake of it. That's what I quite often experience my management as doing, just disciplining for the sake of it. Just they don't, they're trying to work out what their role is and they just sort of misfire quite often in their attempts to like
well, and that's the thing too. I mean, that's the difference between a manager and a supervisor, right? I mean, like a manager sees I'm not about to be like pro supervisor. I'm not saying anything about supervisors, but I'm saying like, oh, my supervisor's pretty cool if you're listening. I'm saying like managers, all they see is, you open, they're in their office and then it closes, right? I mean, obviously they're like a good manager and, I do have a pretty good managers and stuff. It's like they're about the shop and they, help when they need to and stuff. But really what they see at the end of the day is, oh, we sold $8,000 worth of stuff today, right?
Yes.
And it's like, so that's like when you come up to them and you have problems about like, hey, we're out of this and the customer really wants it and they paid for it or whatever, they'll just, the answer that is just like, okay, whatever, give them a refund, give them whatever they want as long as it's like a less price.
Sure,
so there is like a hands-off approach when you need them to be hands-on and a hands-on approach when it's like, just what are you doing? Get out of here. You know what I mean? Anyway,
but it's interesting. You make an interesting point that like when it comes down to it, They're just there to facilitate the extraction of wealth
Exactly.
from you upwards.
Exactly.
In some
Well, that's the
direction,
thing.
kind of
Like their bosses.
I mean, they're salaried in some respects as well. What
Exactly.
they're getting paid for. I mean,
Yeah.
but this is the thing. Like, how much do they contribute to the production of a product that,
yeah.
whatever product that you are making? How much did they contribute to the ability to have that product
Exactly.
valorize itself by selling?
Yeah.
They do make a contribution. So,
Yeah.
their allegiance might be to the service of capital, kind of thing, but simply under a definition of helping capital create more capital. If you work for a salary and your work involves you fulfilling that process of capital expanding, does that make you a worker? I think that's the crux of the problem that he's presenting, kind of thing. Right?
Exactly.
And if not, we need to draw a line, and this is where we get back to all this sort of scale of regard business, like.
Well, and I think,
but I think it does pose the question of, do you even need to draw a line? I think presumably he's saying yes.
Yeah.
But on a tactical basis, it's an open question for me. I think, like, if you're engaged in a struggle and it's an interest, if you want to find allies for your struggle,
well,
anybody's a possibility.
Exactly. And check this out for a transition. I think that it's all going to come down to a rebirth of culture, and it's all going to come down to rebranding what you're doing. You can't just be like, oh, we're only for the workers, dude. Like, fuck the managers or whatever. Like, we don't need bosses. Because you're going to need some form of like, well, everything would operate better if we did it like this, if you want to get those people on board. And we're going to bring out that classic word, because he talks about it later in the chapter. I think this has a lot to do with ideology. Look at that. I'm just going to quote him here. He says, ideology for Marx and Engels is precisely the attempt to universalize and give the ideal form to what are no more than limited, class-bound ideas and interests. It is in this sense that they use the word ideology pejoratively, meaning as a false representation of reality for most people, right? Because, I mean, like, if you are of the ruling class, it's like, this is the world for me. This is, the ideology that we've created is how not only things work for us, but it's like how we want things to work, So after some of our conversations last week, I went and picked up some Louis Althusser. And so we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in a later episode. But it really got me thinking about the role of ideology in creating a society, right? And how it really, I mean, I guess, exactly what he says right there. The current ideology of the times in terms of capitalism and everything is just completely class-bound, because it's not in anyone else's best interests. As we were saying with the managers, it's not really in their best interests unless they're happy with, like, whatever, like, mathematically the lowest salary possible to keep them on board is, to make them feel better than everybody else. It's not in really anybody else's best interest either. Yeah. Got me thinking about the what is it, RSAs and is it ISAs? Yeah, ISAs. Ideological.
Oh, yeah, state apparatuses.
Yeah.
Repressive state apparatuses.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know very much about that at all.
We'll get there.
We'll get there.
Okay, hopefully one day we'll get there.
Okay. But it's interesting, that quote that you make from the book. He's talking. That's from the section where he's moved on to talking about the consciousness of classes.
Exactly.
Sort of like, some respects, the subjective element. How are people thinking about themselves? And there he's talking about the bourgeois class, like the ruling class.
Yeah.
They have a consciousness. And he's defining it there as like false consciousness in some respects. It's false because they ideologically believe that what serves them is the universal interest, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which is going to let them down in some respects. Like it is a false understanding of how the world works.
Yeah.
In some respects, they're unwilling to grapple with some of the questions raised by something like Marxism.
Yeah.
Because it's a sort of a fundamental attack on their modus operandi.
I don't know. I'll push back on that a little.
Sure.
I do kind of think it's a little like naive in some sense, because I think for probably the majority of we're just gonna fall back on that. The cat just opened the door. That was weird. That's what I thought. I was like, is that the wind? Again, we are just going to fall back on the words bourgeoisie and proletariat, right? Because, I mean, for most of the bourgeoisie, he's basically just saying that this is a false consciousness, right? And that maybe if they were given the full ideas of everything, the full facts, they might not actually believe this, maybe. But I kind of feel like for the upper echelons, that's not true. They know that it's not. If we're talking about like post-war robber barons, we're talking about like the Rockefellers or something. They knew that ideology was fake and everything. And there's no way that's the case for like the top, right? The people actually making the decisions, the people who were actually like, well, what about if we invaded Libya so we could get back all of our oil, right? I mean, like, the ideology, I don't think really, the point that he's making, I think, maybe for, like, their families and for, like, most of the bourgeoisie, but I don't know. It's a false consciousness to a certain extent. I guess I'll just say that.
I mean, it's an argument that I've gotten into a few times with different people, and I go back and forth on it. And there are different positions to hold. The question basically is, how much of a villain can you make of the ruling class? Are they just fulfilling a socially required function?
Yeah.
Or are they? To really personalize it or to humanize it, are they doing evil?
Yeah.
I've had conversations with my dad in the past, and he's kind of like, no, they're just bastards. Kind of thing. Well, maybe he'd probably cop to thinking that if he hadn't said it.
I would say,
but I've always sort of like for a time I was very much more on the structural train of like, it's a feature of structural relations. There was a necessity to act in X, Y, and Z way. But how able are they to be conscious of what the structure of capitalist society demands of them?
Yeah.
When they're sometimes not even willing to say that capitalism is a thing with sort of bounded historical existence, kind of thing. Or
I tend to think
not even willing to recognise that it doesn't represent human nature in some way, but simply a historically bounded and contingent set of social relations.
Yeah, I tend to think that is, again, kind of the issue with just saying bourgeoisie and proletariat and ruling class and exploited class or something, because it is just a little bit too vague, and I think you lose something in understanding of the way actual power structures work in just saying that this is a false consciousness, right? Because I think, it's probably a false consciousness for, like, the Duke or whatever that lives in the local castle, which I can't believe I'm actually saying that's actually
a thing that exists.
That is actually still a thing that exists here. But, it's probably like that for, say, like, the dude who owns, like, some of the biggest, maybe like law firms on Wall Street or something like that. But it's definitely not it's not a false consciousness for somebody who's on the Council for Foreign Relations, you know what I mean? And I think that there's a pretty big difference between those two types of people. And I don't know.
There's different levels of ruling class consciousness, right? Like, they have some sense of their interests in which they want to defend, and can probably quite readily unite to face down certain threats.
Sure.
But at the same time, the bourgeois class is divided along as many lines as the working class is. There are different types of capital. There are different types of way of making your money. You can see it in terms of something like the Brexit debate, right? Like, financial capital, totally on board. Like Farage, a city trader background. Like, they shouldn't personalize it as individuals. Like, it does seem in general as well, like, very much more comfortable with the idea of Brexit than capitalists who are actually still involved in the production of some kind of commodity where they need the free movement of labour, they need the free movement of capital that the European Union provides. So they can't. The ruling class doesn't necessarily share an interest in all cases, kind of thing. And he does also say, just as a sort of historical side note, that usually can be quite historically short-sighted.
Sure.
Like, can fight a corner when there's really no need to fight something. Far better to concede a certain reform than fight it to the bitter end, kind of thing. And yes, they don't necessarily like.
Although I will say it's not like we're definitely not trying to make the point that, there are like splits in the ruling class ideology of like when it comes to Brexit, obviously there are like some people who are like, maybe not. And so, some people in the ruling class are like, why not? That could be cool.
Sure.
It all does come down to capital, and it all does come down to what's going to make the most money. And the difference is on an individual basis what's going to make them the most money. It is still the same ideology. Of
I'm not in any way suggesting that one of those camps of capital ought to be something that the working class would ally with.
Exactly.
But at the same time, to recognise those factions fractious factions, fractious factional conflicts, is productive as a reading of the political circumstances under which you operate, kind of thing. Maybe it can give you a groundwork for how to act, how to behave.
Yeah. So I guess just to round out a couple more of the key points that he makes here, he does talk about consciousness, about how do you need a political party do you need the working class to be organized into a political party for it to officially receive the platinum trophy, gold medals of class conscious? You know what I mean? Do you need that? What would that even look like? I've always been kind of interested in that idea, and I kind of understand what he's saying now about why you would need a political party, and it is interesting, right? Because I mean, that's kind of where Marxism as a political theory obviously breaks with like anarchism and stuff like that, because they say, here's what politics is, here's what class is, here's where all this conflict comes from, but where we'll stop is you need to engage in the political process to get things done, right? Politics is a sham. We all want it to be over with. No one wants politics. It sucks, right? But you do need to engage with it if you want to get something done, which is interesting, right? Because I mean, obviously when you're first introduced to the ideas, you don't want to admit to that. You want to just be like, nah, man, like the whole system's messed up. Like, let's just go for it. Let's just get rid of it completely, right? But this is, I think, kind of showing some of the maturity of more orthodox Marxist thought. That's like, no, you do need to engage with the political spectrum if you ever want to get anything done. You know? Yeah.
Should we eject the cat?
Should we eject the cat? I think some purring's going to come up on the microphone, but I think that's fine.
Yeah. We could pick up some, could deliberately record some cat noises.
Yeah, some lion noises.
Yeah. Some lion roars. So I mean, like what you've raised there is, we've talked about the class consciousness of the ruling class. There's the question of the class consciousness of the working class is left open as of yet. What is the nature of that consciousness? Yeah, and he does
also just make like a minor point where he basically just says all these big points about, you need the political party, you need all this stuff, you need to engage, you need to actually get stuff done. But he also just goes, well, you can just consider yourself class conscious if you understand the problems and you know what needs to be done. Which the last part of that sentence, you know what needs to be done,
quite daunting.
You just get like a sound effect of like, oh god.
Yeah, I mean, he says that class consciousness for Marx, all it really means is you recognize that your interest is in the overthrow of capitalism.
Yeah,
which says quite a lot. But also leaves a great deal open.
Big Ten.
The DSA Big Ten. Well, you're not allowed to talk about that.
Yeah. Oh god, my lawyers. They're shaking.
But he suggests that for Marx, that's basically a thing left open for the working class movement that would develop. Like he says, like in some respects, like later Marxists have seen in the idea of consciousness as something like a catechism, or that's the word he uses, like something that's really doctrinal. You have to fulfill specific functions to consider a collection of working class actors to be class conscious. And he's suggesting that for Marx gave absolutely no guideline stipulations on what class consciousness means, other than deciding that like capitalism and its continued existence was so injurious to your well-being that you were going to have to get rid of it.
But that's good though, in a certain extent.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The history of Marxism has seen all these unfortunate trips or digressions into like trying to define what exactly consciousness is. I mean, he even suggests that like he expands that definition for Marx of consciousness to mean revolutionarily class conscious. But then makes a distinction that you should not confuse being revolutionarily class conscious to mean insurrection.
Exactly.
You don't have to be like if you're, because I mean there were some wings of left wing communism that like for whom there is no class conscious proletariat until you're in an insurrectionary moment, kind of thing. Which is something that I've sort of held with in the past.
Sure. I mean, it's cool.
It's pretty cool.
It's pretty cool, but like imagine standing up to even like local enforcement in America, you know what I mean?
But if you hinge all of your hopes on But for those groups, I mean, like the continued existence of like institutional representation of labor in the form of trade unions or whatever is just reinforcing the relationships of capital. It's only like an imminent break with everything.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, like, I don't know. I quite like a kind of like destroy everything. My general political outlook is destroy everything.
I mean, that would be great.
Yeah.
That would be great. That's the thing. It's like that would be great, but it's like, at what point do you need to have the more mature, like, okay, engage with politics?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and coming right around to it, like he's like. He obviously shows that he takes some examples both from Marx and from Lemon. From Lemming, from Yemen, from Lenin, to show cases where they were both quite happy to get sort of down into the muck of bourgeois politics, like engage in ways that you can, because it's not a matter of what you are doing; it's a matter of like to what end are you directing your politics, kind of thing.
Exactly.
It's possible to engage and to fight for things that somebody more militant might consider to be reforms. But yeah, it is your political strategy one which intends to ameliorate the worst elements of capitalism, or to actually like take steps toward its overthrow. Now, I feel like I've just said something which was meant to be very matter of fact, and it's actually very broad. Because like you could pretend that you were on a revolutionary road, but through reforms never really advance.
Or vice versa. Let's see someone do that. That'd be cool. Someone who's saying, "No, I'm just here for reform."
Just for reform, but like I'm a secret. That was the secret. I mean, it was my secret hope with like John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn, right? Like,
could have been.
Yeah.
I still hold out hope. But he does that whole idea of reform versus revolution kind of made me think about like, okay, reforms are obviously something that are. If I see someone fighting for reforms, I'm obviously like, cool, good for that's great. I love reforms. Love a good reform. And reforms are badly needed.
Save lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think that the point that maybe not that he's making, but that needs to be made is that once you pursue a solely reformist agenda in government, then you're just going to be trapped in that forever. Once you become a reformist party, you cross the line at some point into just this whirlpool of just engaging with capitalist structures and everything that goes along with that. And I think you can to that extent lose something of the revolutionary outlook that you might have.
Sure.
Because I think that can just be so soul-sucking and so hard and so difficult to do.
And obviously you get stuck into a very small in world historic timescales, 4 or 5 years political terms.
Yeah.
Or in American context where you get 2 years where you potentially functionally have some kind of like democratic majority before it's sort of like taken away in the next election kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
I did have some faith in the sort of idea of like non-reformist reforms that were being banded around by the last leadership of the Labour Party, or people associated with it.
Some of those reforms were huge if they could have gotten passed, like about shifting ownership of some corporate structures to workers. That would have been huge.
Or if you can like permanently decommodify certain sectors of like Yeah, I mean, you can call that a reform. I mean, to say cease. Jesus. Yeah, I mean, it's barely a reform, is it? To cease. I mean, it was clearly quite revolutionary in the eyes of our class opposition.
Exactly.
And its agents.
Well, so is like anything. So it's like making.
Sure. Yeah.
I do want to go back real quick, if
please.
You're all right with this, just to the idea that you brought up of the problem of defining a working class consciousness, right? So I want to quote him here. He says, one consequence of this is to turn, meaning defining class consciousness, is to turn class consciousness into a catechismal orthodoxy, departure and dissent from which becomes grave and punishable offenses. Another consequence is to enhance tremendously the role of the keepers of the orthodoxy, namely the party leaders and their appointees. If revolutionary consciousness can be so precisely defined, then there must be an authority to define it, and then to decide when and in what ways it must be modified. So going back to the idea of the fact that you can still go see Lenin in a little glass box. I suppose that this really does point to the necessity of any kind of definitions that you're coming to in Marxism with a chapter full of definitions, need to be absolutely dynamic, and they need to be fluid. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere.
Sure,
Marxism needs to be dynamic, and it needs to not get stuck in this idea of, because he kind of, in this chapter, he does kind of go in a little bit on the Communist Manifesto about the line of like society splitting up more and more into two hostile camps.
Yeah, it's an interesting correction that he makes to what I would have read to that. Like, he's saying hostile camps, but he's not saying those camps are classes.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
And so, like, the composition of those camps might contain. I mean, obviously, like, clearly it implies like certain class interests will be on one side and certain class interests will be represented on the other. But who falls on what side of that line? Who recognises their interest to be with the continuation of capitalism, or who recognises their interest to lie best with the possibilities of a more emancipated society, or less alienated?
Exactly.
It is an open question.
Yeah.
That's the sort of like that's the political avenue or direction that we're facing down, kind of thing.
Yeah, and that quote really does get you to think, and this is going down some alternate history stuff, but it's like, if you need to define working class and ruling class and even just class and conflict and all of these things, and it seemed necessary in revolutions like the Russian Revolution, or other socialist revolutions, Cuba, or really anywhere, I guess. If you have to make those definitions and really stick to an orthodoxy, are those socialist revolutions kind of doomed in one way or another to fail? Because you do get, you're not obviously going to get this. Nothing's is going for sure to happen or anything like that. But you obviously, in a lot of those situations, you did get cults of personality.
Sure.
And even when you didn't get that, you did get, I'm sure there's a phrase for this, I just can't think of it, cults of personality around ideology, which is not dynamic at all. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it just gets you to think, are those first crop, second crop, third crop of socialist revolutions, were they doomed to fail? You know what I mean? Cat is scratching the couch. That's good. But yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I mean,
how do you make something dynamic?
I would. We would need to dig into what really happened in some of those revolutionary moments, and to try and find a way of having a good idea of how the people engaged in those struggles actually conceived of themselves. How because one of the points that he makes that's tangential to what you're trying to suggest is that those agents in a revolutionary situation don't have some kind of like pure consciousness. You're never going to achieve a point where everybody's sort of like synthesized to the same
exactly
same idea. You have lots of people who are like political situations are messy, and people and I don't have a good enough handle on how what happened in various revolutionary situations. It would seem like every time as you say, or you're correct to say, that whenever you get to the point where some kind of orthodoxy needs to be enforced or strictly defined, you've lost that revolutionary energy that was present
in
1917 or any other kind of thing. But I mean, like the defeat of the communist revolution in Russia, when it happened and why, and I mean it's quite a long, it will be quite complicated.
Sure, yeah, and I don't want to downplay like any other external factors like foreign pressure, which is like the main reason most of these regimes have fallen apart. It's interesting, when I was back home most recently, I was talking about like Latin American leftist revolutions. And someone I was talking about it with said something to the effect of, I mean, all of that sounds great. We were like talking about Allende and stuff, and he was like, but I do feel like a lot of Central and South American and Caribbean like leftist revolutions, there's a lot to be said about like authoritarianism down there. And it's like, well, okay, if we're going to talk about authoritarianism, sure, some of that might have to do with what Miliband calls the catechismal orthodoxy, right? But it also has to do with, if you're someone like Allende, you're just going to lose power pretty quickly as soon as the first coup pops up, or Arbenz or somebody in Guatemala, somebody like that.
Big a tent.
Exactly. Too big a tent. Exactly. Or if you're someone like Fidel and Che, and you're just like, no, I don't know. All that is to say, I didn't want to like imply that it is all just this cult of personality, because there are obviously other factors.
Sure.
But that is a huge issue, obviously, in confronting any kind of politics within the socialist realm, right? having to deal with that orthodoxy and what that means.
Sure.
And trying to be dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you? I mean, really, what we're talking about is how do you instill a strong enough democratic tradition that you can.
Yeah. I guess we should probably try and wrap it up. But one more quote I want to read. Maybe we can just go out on this. Is he says, in other words, revolutionary consciousness is not some kind of Marxist state of grace, which, once achieved, is total and irreversible. It is a certain understanding of the nature of the social order and of what needs to be done about it. So we kind of already touched on that, but I think that's a good place to have parting thoughts on, because, he spends this whole chapter being like, this is what Marx said. It is a little bit dynamic, but you need to understand class. You need to understand conflict. You need to understand all of these definitions. It can't be the liberal definition. It's got to be the Marxist definition. But then at the end of the day, it's like, understand this. Get it, you're on your way to being class conscious, but there's no capital C class consciousness, right? It is just this. You're never going
to be the paragon of virtuous kind of like.
Exactly. Yeah. So.
Yeah, in 100 years, everything that we believe is going to be like
exactly
horribly out of date. Kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. When we have beachfront property
here. Yeah. But he does compare some sort of readings of class consciousness to a kind of like Hegelian unfolding of an idea, but he snaps back at that, saying that like it's entirely a historical phenomena. It's not something you cannot reach a position whereby you stand outside of history.
Exactly.
You're sort of stuck in the position that you're in. You're faced with the class forces and the dynamics that you exist around. And you just have to make your best effort to work out in what direction you like.
Yeah.
Flail to advance toward communism.
Exactly.
Flailing toward communism.
Flailing towards communism, which in itself is some et cetera, blah, 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 something, an auxiliary statement of some kind. Yeah. Still haven't really done much in terms of setting up any kind of pages for any of this. We don't have anything to plug. But hopefully by the time this goes up, we will, and there'll be links and everything. I think this is pretty good.
Yeah.
About almost an hour and 15 of recording time in terms of one chapter.
Cool, solid. And there's quite a lot of things that we've like.
Yeah, we've glossed
but
over,
I think we've had.
Yeah, exactly.
We've had a conversation.
Yeah, we've had a conversation. I think it went well. Hopefully, I didn't sound like too much of an idiot.
Was the lighting much more to your?
It is actually. I think maybe it's just because it's darker outside now, but. It's a little bit more like an interrogation because there's just the one light directly above me. So
I did offer you a second light, but we did.
The second light almost made me more nervous somehow.
Maybe we'll just podcast in the dark. Maybe that's the answer.
Exactly. Only podcast with the lights off.
Okay.
So on that fun note, this is auxiliary statements. Hopefully we made some.
Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If you have,
if there is anyone listening, or hi mom, if you are listening. Auxiliary statements. I'm Jack.
Dan.
And
see you next time.
And the cat. See you next time. Woo!
The winner.
The music you heard this episode is Music to Kill Bad People 2 by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can check out this song and more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you like this episode, be sure and follow us up at Aux Statements on Twitter. That's AUX Statements on Twitter.com. And be sure and tune in next episode for more commie discussion. Till next time.